Section 7 of L'Assommoir. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. L'assommoir by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest A. Visité. Third part of Chapter 2. On Coupeau's side, this continual familiarity inflamed him more and more, until it began to seriously bother him. He began to feel tense and uneasy. He continued with his foolish talk, never failing to ask her, "When will it be?" She understood what he meant and teased him. He would then come to visit her, carrying his bedroom slippers, as if he were moving in. She joked about it, and continued calmly, without blushing at the illusions with which he was always surrounding her. She stood for anything from him, as long as he didn't get rough. She only got angry once, when he pulled a strand of her hair while trying to force a kiss from her. Towards the end of June, Coupeau lost his liveliness. He became most peculiar. Gervaise, feeling uneasy at some of his glances, barricaded herself in at night. Then, after having sulked ever since the Sunday, he suddenly came on the Tuesday night about 11 o'clock and knocked at her room. She would not open to him, but his voice was so gentle and so trembling that she ended by removing the chest of drawers she had pushed against the door. When he entered, she thought he was ill. He looked so pale, his eyes were so red, and the veins on his face were all swollen. And he stood there, stuttering and shaking his head. No, he was not ill. He had been crying for 2 hours upstairs in his room. He wept like a child, biting his pillow so as not to be heard by the neighbors. For 3 nights past he had been unable to sleep. It could not go on like that. "Listen, Madame Gervaise," said he, with a swelling in his throat and on the point of bursting out crying again. "We must end this, mustn't we? We'll go and get married. It's what I want. I've quite made up my mind." Gervaise showed great surprise. She was very grave. "Oh, Monsieur Coupeau," murmured she, "whatever are you thinking of? You know I've never asked you for that. I didn't care about it, that was all. Oh, no, it's serious now. Think of what you are saying, I beg of you." But he continued to shake his head with an air of unalterable resolution. He had already thought it all over. He had come down because he wanted to have a good night. She wasn't going to send him back to weep again, he supposed. As soon as she said yes, he would no longer bother her, and she could go quietly to bed. He only wanted to hear her say yes. They could talk it over on the morrow. "But I suddenly can't say yes just like that," resumed Gervaise. "I don't want you to be able to accuse me later on of having incited you to do a foolish thing. You shouldn't be so insistent, Monsieur Coupeau. You can't really be sure that you're in love with me. If you didn't see me for a week, it might fade away. Sometimes men get married, and then there's day after day, stretching out into an entire lifetime, and they get pretty well bored by it all. Sit down there. I'm willing to talk it over at once." Then, until 1 in the morning, in the dark room and by the faint light of a smoky tallow candle which they forgot to snuff, they talked of their marriage, lowering their voices so as not to wake the 2 children, Claude and Etienne, who were sleeping, both heads on the same pillow. Gervaise kept pointing out the children to Coupeau. What a funny kind of dowry they were. She really shouldn't burden him with them. Besides, what would the neighbors say? She'd feel ashamed for him because everyone knew about the story of her life and her lover. They wouldn't think it decent if they saw them getting married barely 2 months later. Coupeau replied by shrugging his shoulders. He didn't care about the neighbors. He never bothered about their affairs. So there was Lantier before him. Well, so what? What's so bad about that? She hadn't been constantly bringing men upstairs, as some women did, even rich ladies. The children would grow up. They'd raise them right. Never had he known before such a woman, such sound character, so good-hearted. Anyway, she could have been anything, a street-walker, ugly, lazy and good for nothing, with a whole gang of dirty kids, and so what? He wanted her. "Yes, I want you," he repeated, bringing his hand down on his knee with a continuous hammering. "You understand, I want you. There's nothing to be said to that, is there?" Little by little, Gervaise gave way. Her emotions began to take control when faced with his encompassing desire. Still, with her hands in her lap and her face suffused with a soft sweetness, she hesitantly offered objections. From outside, through the half-open window, a lovely June night breathed in puffs of sultry air, disturbing the candle with its long wick, gleaming red like a glowing coal. In the deep silence of the sleeping neighborhood the only sound was the infantile weeping of a drunkard lying in the middle of the street. Far away, in the back room of some restaurant, a violin was playing a dance tune for some late party. Coupeau was silent. Then, knowing she had no more arguments, he smiled, took hold of her hands and pulled her toward him. She was in one of those moments of weakness she so greatly mistrusted, persuaded at last, too emotionally stirred to refuse anything or to hurt anyone's feelings. Coupeau didn't realize that she was giving way. He held her wrists so tightly as to almost crush them. Together they breathed a long sigh that to both of them meant a partial satisfaction of their desire. "You'll say yes, won't you?" asked he. "How you worry me," she murmured. "You wish it? Well then, yes. Ah, we're perhaps doing a very foolish thing." He jumped up and, seizing her round the waist, kissed her roughly on the face, at random. Then, as this caress caused a noise, he became anxious and went softly and looked at Claude and Etienne. "Hush, we must be careful," said he in a whisper, "and not wake the children. Good-bye till tomorrow." And he went back to his room. Gervaise, all in a tremble, remained seated on the edge of her bed without thinking of undressing herself for nearly an hour. She was touched. She felt that Coupeau was very honorable, for at one moment she had really thought it was all over, and that he would forget her. The drunkard below under the window was now hoarsely uttering the plaintive cry of some lost animal. The violin in the distance had left off its saucy tune and was now silent. During the following days Coupeau sought to get Gervaise to call some evening on his sister in the Rue de la Goutte d'Or, but the young woman, who was very timid, showed a great dread of this visit to the Lorilleux. She knew that Coupeau had a lingering fear of that household, even though he certainly wasn't dependent on his sister, who wasn't even the oldest of the family. Mamma Coupeau would certainly give her consent at once, and she never refused her only son anything. The thing was that the Lorilleuxs were supposed to be earning 10 francs a day or more, and that gave them a certain authority. Coupeau would never dare to get married unless his wife was acceptable to them. "I have spoken to them of you, they know our plans," explained he to Gervaise. "Come now, what a child you are! Let's call on them this evening. I've warned you, haven't I? You'll find my sister rather stiff. Lorilleux, too, isn't always very amiable. In reality they are greatly annoyed, because if I marry I shall no longer take my meals with them, and it'll be an economy the less. But that doesn't matter, they won't turn you out. Do this for me, it's absolutely necessary." These words only frightened Gervaise the more. One Saturday evening, however, she gave in. Coupeau came for her at 8:30. She had dressed herself in a black dress, a crepe shawl with yellow palms, and a white cap trimmed with a little cheap lace. During the 6 weeks she had been working, she had saved the 7 francs for the shawl, and the 2½ francs for the cap. The dress was an old one cleaned and made up afresh. "They are expecting you," said Coupeau to her, as they went round by the Rue de Poissonniers. "Oh, they're beginning to get used to the idea of my being married. They seem nice indeed, to-night. And you know, if you've never seen gold chains made, it'll amuse you to watch them. They just happen to have a pressing order for Monday." "They've got gold in their room?" asked Gervaise. "I should think so. There's some on the walls, on the floor, in fact, everywhere." They had passed the arched doorway and crossed the courtyard. The Lorilleuxs lived on the 6th floor, staircase B. Coupeau laughingly told her to hold the handrail tight and not to leave go of it. She looked up and blinked her eyes as she pierced the tall hollow tower of the staircase, lighted by 3 gas jets, one on every second landing. The last one, right up at the top, looked like a star twinkling in a black sky, whilst the other 2 cast long flashes of light of fantastic shapes among the interminable windings of the stairs. "By Jove!" said the zinc worker as he reached the 1st floor, smiling. "There's a strong smell of onion soup. Someone's having onion soup, I'm sure." Staircase B, with its grey, dirty steps and handrail, its scratched walls and chipped plaster, was full of strong kitchen odors. Long corridors, echoing with noise, led away from each landing. Doors painted yellow gaped open, smeared black around the latch from dirty hands. A sink on each landing gave forth a fetid humidity, adding its stench to the sharp flavor of the cooking of onions. From the basement all the way to the 6th floor You could hear dishes clattering, saucepans being rinsed, pots being scraped and scoured. On the first floor Gervaise saw a half-open door with the word "Designer" written on it in large letters. Inside were two men sitting by a table, the dishes cleared away from its oilcloth cover, arguing furiously amid a cloud of pipe smoke. The second and third floors were quieter, and through cracks in the woodwork only such sounds filtered as the rhythm of a cradle rocking, the stifled crying of a child, a woman's voice sounding like the dull murmur of running water with no words distinct. Gervaise read the various signs on the doors giving the names of the occupants. Madame Gaudron, wool carder, and Monsieur Madinier, cardboard boxes. There was a fight in progress on the fourth floor, a stomping of feet that shook the floor, furniture banged around, a racket of curses and blows, but this did not bother the neighbors opposite, who were playing cards with their door opened wide to admit more air. When Gervaise reached the fifth floor she had to stop to take a breath. She was not used to going up so high. That wall forever turning, the glimpses she had of the lodgings following each other, made her head ache. Anyway, there was a family almost blocking the landing, the father washing the dishes over a small earthenware stove near the sink, and the mother sitting with her back to the stair rail and cleaning the baby before putting it to bed. Coupeau kept urging Gervaise along, and they finally reached the sixth floor. He encouraged her with a smile. They had arrived. She had been hearing a voice all the way up from the bottom, and she was gazing upward, wondering where it could be coming from, a voice so clear and piercing that it had dominated all the other sounds. It came from a little old woman in an attic room who sang while putting dresses on cheap dolls. When a tall girl came by with a pail of water and entered a nearby apartment, Gervaise saw a tumbled bed on which a man was sprawled, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. As the door closed behind her, Gervaise saw the handwritten card, Mademoiselle Clemence, ironing. Now that she had finally made it to the top, her legs weary and her breath short, Gervaise leaned over the railing to look down. Now it was the gaslight on the first floor which seemed a distant star at the bottom of a narrow well 6 stories deep. All the odors and all the murmurings of the immense variety of life within the tenement came up to her in one stifling breath that flushed her face as she hazarded a worried glance down into the gulf below. "We're not there yet," said Coupeau. "Oh, it's quite a journey." He had gone down a long corridor on the left. He turned twice, the first time also to the left, the second time to the right. The corridor still continued branching off, narrowing between walls full of crevices, with plaster peeling off, and lighted at distant intervals by a slender gas jet. And the doors, all alike, succeeded each other the same as the doors of a prison or a convent, and nearly all open, continued to display homes of misery and work, which the hot June evening filled with a reddish mist. At length they reached a small passage in complete darkness. "We're here," resumed the zinc worker. "Be careful, keep to the wall, there are 3 steps." And Gervaise carefully took another 10 steps in the obscurity. She stumbled and then counted the 3 steps. But at the end of the passage Coupeau had opened the door without knocking. A brilliant light spread over the tiled floor. They entered. It was a narrow apartment, and seemed as if it were the continuation of the corridor. A faded woolen curtain, raised up just then by a string, divided the place in 2. The first part contained a bedstead pushed beneath an angle of the attic ceiling, a cast-iron stove still warm from the cooking of the dinner, 2 chairs, a table and a wardrobe, the corners of which had had to be sawn off to make it fit in between the door and the bedstead. The second part was fitted up as a workshop, at the end a narrow forge with its bellows, to the right a vise fixed to the wall beneath some shelves on which pieces of old iron lay scattered, to the left near the window a small workman's bench encumbered with greasy and very dirty pliers, shears, and microscopical saws, all very dirty and grimy. "It's us!" cried Coupeau, advancing as far as the woolen curtain. End of second part of chapter 2.